We have seen the last lecture that the figure of the habitant was for people like César-Côté, like La Liberté, or even Massicotte, a figure of really that reflect what they call the soul of the French Canadian. And we have seen also how these painters or sculptors were backed by an ideology that I mentioned as ruralism, if you want, or to take the expression of Michel Brunet, of the historian Michel Brunet, agriculturalism, but also when Chanoine Groux took over, you see all this idea, was strongly nationalist also. And today we will see a kind of people that extend a little bit this idea or resist to it. So we'll have an example of somebody who is a kind of prolongation of what we have seen last time, even if at first sight you will see it's very, very different. And another one who seems to be closer to César-Côté, you will see why I say that, and in fact is much more detached than at first sight. So it's a kind of a paradox in both cases. They are quite interesting painters, both of them, very strong thinking and quite original also. I want to speak first of Stanley Cosgrove, and then after of Louis Muhlstock. Okay, so that will be our two heroes, if you want, for this lecture. Okay, about Stanley Cosgrove, I will start with telling you a story about an event, you see, and how I was even tempted about a non-event, and you will see why. It is the famous exhibition of Première Exposition des Indépendants. I show you just the cover, the little catalogue that was published at that time. It was shown in Quebec City, Foyer Montcalm. It's a place where you could exhibit. And it was organized by a Dominican priest, Father Couturier, who was a French man, living in New York and being responsible of the French parish of New York, but because he was French, came often in Canada and even also taught in our schools, both at l'École des Beaux-Arts and at l'École du Meuble. And he organized with people that he met there this exhibition, who was, in fact, a good exhibition of, you would say, of modern art. For instance, Bordeaux there had a picture of a still life, nothing too non-figurative. And maybe the more advanced picture that was in this show was by Alfred Pellan. It was called Sous Terre, Underground, if you want. And everything was nice and open, except that at a certain moment, the director of the School of Fine Arts, Charles Maillard, you remember we spoke of him in a previous lecture, decided to write a letter to the newspaper in which he says basically that he wants to congratulate the exhibitor of this show and to announce also that he's organizing another show in Quebec with more people also of the free tendency, like he says. And then finally he had, and this was more less expected, he said, this show of the Indépendant shows how the teaching of our schools of art are excellent. So, as if they administered the proof, let's say, of their excellency. We could doubt a little bit of the sincerity of Maillard, because if this show was presenting, this Indépendant show, was giving us a good idea of the excellency of the School of Fine Arts, why to have another one in Quebec with other people and of the same tendency? And so the Indépendant decided to clarify the situation and wrote a letter that was published also in a newspaper in answering to Maillard. I will read you a part of it, and you will see exactly what was their reaction. They says, we have read in a Quebec City newspaper dated May 5, 1941, a letter in which the director of the Montreal School of Fine Arts announcing an exhibition will be a reply to our own, acknowledge at the same time the quality of our works. But since, by the same token, he claims for his school the merit of our formation, we want, without making personal or offensive remarks, put the record straight on this subject. Let us be clear, as long as we were progressing in the knowledge of our art, we could not deplore the teaching method of the school, and it took us years to disengage from their teaching, to forget their formulas and mental habit, in short, to disintoxicate us from them. So it was really a put down of Maillard and his method of teaching at the School of Fine Arts. As you can imagine, a letter like that. It was signed by all the exhibitors of the Indépendant except two. One was Cosgrove, and we will have to ask ourselves why he didn't sign it. The other was Marie Bouchard, Marie-Cécile Bouchard, if you want to give her a real name, but if she was called also like Marie Bouchard, was so-called naive painter of Charlevoix, never been to school of art of any kind, was a wonderful person and a wonderful painter also, but I think she was living in Baie-Saint-Paul and far from the scene of Montreal. I don't know if anybody thought of her at this moment and to ask her advice and to see if she will come also to sign or even to sign this letter from far like this. Huh? In the case of Cosgrove, it's a little bit more surprising. The fact that he didn't sign the letter could be interpreted maybe as some discrepancy between him and the other who signed it, and all the others who signed it. But we have to be fair. When this exhibition was shown, Cosgrove was not even in Montreal. He was in Mexico. And he could not know of all this quarrel and all that from far like this. And it seems that some of the group tried to contact him, but too late. And anyway, you could say it didn't concern him completely. Yeah. In fact, what's happening in this exhibition of the Indépendant at the time, it is the beginning of the affirmation of modernism as such. But also, they were attacking the school. And when you attack the school in Quebec at the time, you attack the system of education, you attack a very basic thing. Because as you know, the schools were all controlled by the church, except the hard school, to tell the truth. But nevertheless, they were also framed by some rules and some attitude. And they were very, very important in the definition of the Quebec identity, because they taught language, French, and they were also religious school, speaking of Catholicism all the time, and so they were really important in maintaining the Quebec identity. So to attack the school, you understand that have also social and political implication. What were the ideas of Maillard, the director of the School of Fine Arts, and will probably, if it could be one explanation, who could have influenced some of his students. What was his idea can be reconstructed by his declaration, by some publication, or that I will try to present them to you. Because as you will see, he had an influence on Cosgrove thinking. He was born, Maillard was born in Algeria, in Tiaret, so he's a French from the colony, if you want. And he came relatively early in Canada in 1905 and stayed a few years. During that time, he tells the story that he have visited Napoleon Bourassa. Okay? Napoleon Bourassa was a painter, a very academic painter, who was working at the time on a huge thing which is called the apotheosis of Christopher Columbus. So it's I just show you a detail of it because it's so big, and also a kind of first sketch in which you see what he wanted to do. So you have a series of people going in stairs, and finally Christopher Columbus receiving a kind of crown from some goddesses and things. So you see a little bit of the thing. So Maillard tell the story about this visit at Napoleon Bourassa as being very impressive on him. He was very impressed with what he saw. But nevertheless, he went back to France to complete his study, if you want. But then suddenly the First World War happened, and Maillard, good Frenchman, decided to enroll in the what we call the Légion étrangère in France. And so he made the whole war in Europe during that time. He came back in Canada only in 1919. And first he found a job as a teacher of drawing in the schools. And finally, when the École des Beaux-Arts, the School of Fine Arts in Montreal, was created, he became one of their teachers in 1923 to 1925. Yeah? In 1925, the director of the school, Emmanuel Fougerat, after 2 years, he's a Frenchman also, went back to France, and Maillard was named the director of the School of Fine Arts in Montreal. The first speech he gave as a director are interesting, are indicative already of his tendency, let's say. He says, I want to make from that school a school of applied art. This will be a problem later when the creation of the School of Furniture, l'École du Meuble, will be created, will be essentially a school of applied art. So you can understand that this idea of Maillard could come in conflict with what the École du Meuble wanted to do. But at the time, there was no conflict. He says, I want my school to be a school of applied art, and well, one of the reasons it is that our students will find some jobs after they finish the school, because if it's applied art, it's easier than if you are just a painter or sculptor. And but he had something very typical of Maillard. He says, I want my students to join the tradition of their ancestors in which this applied art was so important for them. And he referred, of course, to all these old furniture, all this way to ornament, let's say, the churches in the past and the 17th and 18th century. And he wanted to create a kind of link between his young students and this old tradition. So already you see an aspect of his position. The other thing that he says also, a little bit later, it is that he doesn't want to make a French school in Canada. Well, because France, of course, is ambiguous. It could be la vieille France, if you want, the France of always, with all the tradition and everything, but it could be also the modern France with the new tendency, with all these like you call it, isms, the new school. If you are in 1925, what you have Cubism is already very important, and you are not too far of Surrealism that will start 4 years after. And so you see what he meant by this type of France. So we speak of culture latine, of a Latin culture instead, that France have saved so well. I just read you a little passage and you will see. One thing is sure, we do not want to establish here a French school. To do so will be to kill the beautiful artistic endeavors of the French-Canadian and of the Anglo-Canadian. Sure enough, we must transmit the Latin culture that France has preserved admirably, but our school must stay a Canadian institution, even if its culture comes from teachers immigrated from France. So the idea is you want to have something Canadian, and in a way, he wanted to relate it to a tradition, and he described this tradition as a Latin culture and not French culture. You find this type of vocabulary habitually at the time in France with the extreme right. People are disgusted with the France of today, and they want to relate to older tradition, so they speak of Latin culture instead of French culture. So Maillard is not completely doing that just without thinking. There is some implication here. And he is scared, in fact, of the danger of the new France, of the France of today. In 1931, he gave a speech where you will see suddenly the political implication of this position of Maillard are much more obvious, let's say. And his lecture was called À la conquête d'un domaine, to conquest a domain, if you want. And he will speak of, very bluntly, of a national art. And getting very close to Lionel Groux type of reasoning also. He says, art, which is the most brilliant expression of the ideal and virtues of a people, must be before all national. And in a summary of his lecture given by Jean Elson in a newspaper just a few days after, the expressions are more even determined. He said, art must be national before being human. People without tradition are unable to produce a sensitive work of art. In France, one encounters a movement of international art that constitute for French art a great danger. The same danger threatens our young country. We have to do everything in our power to preserve the national character of our art. Wow. This is something else, when you say art have to be national before being human, as if really this is the important things. And in a way, Maillard is like Joseph de Maistre, one of the French thinker of the right at the end of 18th century, beginning of 19th century. He says, I've seen an Italian, I've seen a Frenchman, I've seen a Scottish and an English, but I never met man itself. Meaning, again, that man itself is a kind of abstraction, but what is real, what is the first thing that in which you are defined is your nation and your language. Very, very strong point of view, quite close to Lionel Groux, in which you have these two things affirmed very, very, very bluntly, if you want. And of course, with this type of thinking, you see that what I was speaking before of particularism, you have an excellent case of that. More than that, in the same type of lectures, Maillard begins also to attack what he calls international trend in art. And you will see then it takes a kind of unpleasant type of turn. Some modern artists have tried to encompass a vast international field, as if all peoples had suddenly become equal in education and thought. This is already making a difference between the people. You see, some are less educated, some are less intelligent, if you want. Already you have this idea of a superior and inferior people. Think of the nomadic people, he says, without a native land, who left no great name in the domain of the plastic art. Well, what nomadic people is thinking about exactly? Is it the Visigoth or the Vandals that we heard of? No, it was a people much closer to you and to me at the time. He says, there is a deplorable artistic movement which has a terrible influence on art production. This movement has been initiated by the Jews, who have never produced any really artistic work and who pretend to dictate everything in art. You see, this position of Maillard also have anti-Semitic overtone. The Jews being nomadic, having no country of their own, never produce any art of consequence, but they pretend to direct everything and to give us the last word in art. And this is the core of his idea. When he condemned international art, he condemned, in fact, the art of modern. He condemned modern art, and he compared it also to the Bolshevik Revolution. Again, this kind of mixture: Jews, modernism, lack of attachment to a land. All these concepts goes together. and are quite typical of what Maillard wanted to do. He was asked by Rumilly, who is an art historian, not an art historian, an historian, if he wanted to preach to his students regionalism. And he answered yes. He says, yes, I have indeed asked my students to take their inspiration from Canadian nature and to deal with themes drawn from the history of Canada. One for their subject matters able to feed the imagination. In a discourse that he gave to the at the end of the academic year to the student, he says, you still have two great inexhaustible themes: religious art as required by our churches, which could be a school in itself and that we have always recommended to you, and historic composition, so little touched upon up to the present, although so precious to the child and the adult of a race. Art is from nowhere, one hears sometimes. This is too easy, not to say specious reasoning. Man is linked to his milieu, whatever he says and whatever he does, unless he renounces to it. And then he gave a comparison that we could illustrate maybe by a picture of Polaiuolo. He says, according to the legend, Hercules was able to kill the giant Antaeus that was invincible up to now, because each time he was with his feet on the ground, nobody could kill him. So what Hercules succeeded to do is to lift him from the ground and then to choke him. This was the subject matter of the fresco of Polaiuolo. You will say, what is the connection? Okay, so that's what he wants. That's what he wants to say. You have to have your feet on the ground, on the land, if you want to produce something. Otherwise, you are dead. If you become to be nomadic and without any connection with your land, with your territory, well, you become also without thinking. Okay, you will see this type of thinking that I tried to summarize by a few quotations and all that, I think is typical of what Maillard was preaching. And so let's go back to the Indépendant and to Cosgrove, you will see, because the same exhibition was presented after in Montreal, but without Cosgrove participation. In fact, as I told you, Cosgrove was in Mexico, and it's only because he had Jules Bazin in Quebec as a friend that he could have some of his paintings shown in the exhibition when it was presented in Quebec. In Montreal, Bazin probably took back his painting, and Cosgrove was not even in the show. The little catalog that he published in Montreal is smaller even than the one in Quebec, and it have a text by Couturier. And Couturier is not so much attacking the nationalism that I just described at Maillard, but more what we could call the I will not say it. Anyway, all this totalitarian type of regime that you have at the time, you are during the war, so the Nazi, the fascist, and were very prominent. And he says they make art of propaganda and never had great art. He says these are the people who cannot produce great art, and not so much, let's say, people not of another direction. So what was, let's try now to see a little bit in what sense that Stanley Cosgrove, that I show you now as a student at the School of Fine Arts, in what sense he was touched by the idea of Maillard, and in what sense also his painting could reflect a little bit of that. There is a letter of Cosgrove that could write in French or in English indifferently. This one is in French, where he answered to the Tenancourt about the problem that they wanted him to be implied in, and this exhibition, the Exposition des Indépendants, they wanted him to participate. And okay, as I told you, he was far, he could not, but after he thought of it, and then you see he declared a little bit his position. There was, if he had the chance to sign it, he would probably not have signed the letter. Il says, je reproche à la plupart de ceux qui critiquent l'école de ne pas prendre the distance. He said people who critic the teaching of the School of Fine Arts are not fair, he says. In fact, he said we were free. Each teacher were pushing us toward our inclinations. And especially all these attacks, he says, against Maillard seems to me completely futile, he says. And he says, d'ailleurs, je le défendrai toujours. And as a matter of fact, I will defend him always. So then you see Cosgrove taking the side of Maillard, and surprisingly, in a way, because their style is very, very different. I show you two nudes done by one and the other, and you will see that Maillard is an academic painter, very realistic and a little bit dull, and a little bit too close to reality, and Cosgrove seems much more modern, much more free in terms of his interpretation of the human body. But so Cosgrove agree, on the other hand, with Maillard on two things. The first one, it is that, like him, he's not sure of what's happening in Europe. And like him, secondly, he wants to create an art who could be not dependent of the School of Paris, if you want, who could be modern, who could be new, but detached from the School of Paris. And in the letter to the Tenancourt that I mentioned before, he speaks of Pellan as an example of what we should not do, I would say. He says, I cannot say that Pellan is not a good painter. Obviously he is, but that's it. I do not see here much originality. He is only one of us doing what thousands of others have done on the other side of the ocean and still do in the United States. In a way, what he suggests, it is that Pellan is a kind of an imitation of the avant-garde of Paris, and he says we have to do something else than that. We have to do something that will be typical of our country and not just derivative, let's say, from the École de Paris. And how to do that, then? So, in fact, Cosgrove thought that he had a model. He had the solution. And the model was Mexico. How come? After he finished his studies, like any good student, let's say, he wanted to go to Europe to learn, especially he was interested in fresco, to make big, big painting. And Europe seems the obvious place. After all, fresco have been taught there for centuries, and especially Italy. And also he was attracted by the great museums that you have in Europe and all that. But suddenly come the war. He got a grant to go to Europe, and he pledged, he asked if it's possible that to change it and for him to go to Mexico, because in Mexico also there was an importance given to fresco. You have the great Mexican artists of the time, La Rivera, Siqueiros, Orozco, les tres grandes, like they are called. And he thought, I could learn fresco there. And he was attracted also by their culture, which, by the way, is American, but is not European. If we have to find some sources, why not go toward Mexico instead of Europe? He had the chance in Mexico, at the end of his stay, the last 8 months, let's see, to meet a very powerful personality, Jose Clemente Orozco. I'll show you an excellent picture of him, a nice photo. And very intense man, very he's part of the three famous fresquists at the time. And to work in collaboration with Orozco for Cosgrove was fantastic. You will see, he'll speak of it in a very positive way. I give you an example of his work. It's called Modern Migration of the Spirit. It's a fresco that he did in the United States, in fact. You will see why. In which you have exactly this mixture of modernism, if you want, and national implication also. It's about the history of Mexico, of its beginning with Cortez and all that, and finally with modern era and with science and everything, but like you call it, the migration of the spirit. But it's in a style who have not much to do with what was seen in France at the time, who is very powerful, and why not to go in that direction instead of just imitating what is done in School of Paris. And in a way, you could say that this was the exception that Couturier have not seen when he was speaking of fascism and of Nazism and all that as being art of propaganda and not great art. That's one Mexico could be an exception of that. It was national and modern. That's what reflection also that was done at the time. These people, the Tres Grandes, Rivera, Orozco, and Siqueiros, for the political reason, finally work a lot in the United States. Like this fresco that I show you was done in Dartmouth College in Hanover. And you have also a famous, huge fresco at Detroit by Diego Rivera, who shows all the workers around working for creation of automobile and things. Anyway, there's a big display of that kind. And Rivera was a Marxist. Was, I would say, even a Trotskyist, really. Siqueiros were more closer to Stalin. He was very much to the left. And when these great frescoes, Mexican frescoes, became to have some orders like this in the United States, they were seen in a very positive way by the left. Because, of course, the alternative in the United States at the time was people like Grant Wood or Thomas Hart Benton that had a lot of contract also fresco here and there, but represented more the right, if you want, like in the famous picture, the American Gothic that everybody knows. So these Mexican artists were kind of a nice diversion, let's say, from this school of American scene, like Grant Wood or others. In Mexico, the situation that made this great art possible was due to some political aspect. Like Alvaro Obregón was the prime minister at the time, and Jose Vasconcelos was his minister of culture and education. And it's him who gave a lot of contract to the frescoes, and with time they could, like this, create frescoes a little bit all over Mexico. When Plutarco Elias Calles succeeded to Obregón, this became less important. He was less enthusiastic with all these people making the fresco very often, very explicitly to the left. He became more to the right himself, and he began to discourage them to continue. So that's why many of them went to United States. That's why also that Orozco and Cosgrove could speak English together. Mind you, Cosgrove was 3 years in Mexico, have catch up also a lot of Spanish, but nevertheless there was a possibility of discussion. For instance, this is one of the fresco done by Orozco in the New School of Social Research in New York, in which you see Gandhi opposing to all the violence of the empire in India, and it's a nice, again, a political content, very explicit, and even with time, he became more and more enthusiastic of Cortez, which is surprising because Cortez was the devil for the others, let's say for the Marxist Rivera or for the Stalinian Siqueiros. Why to make such a fuss with Cortez? It says he was against a very barbaric type of culture. There was the Aztec culture on one hand, and he was not backed also by Spain. And so he was like the man alone. And Orozco, with time, became to see himself like this also. I'm like the individual. I don't want to be associated too much to a specific party, let's say, or a specific direction. I'm looking, let's say, for man against God, for freedom against violence and everything. So it's as if with time he became to find in his nationalist theme something more more universal in a way. Here you see him in conversation, Cosgrove and Orozco together in his studio. And when Cosgrove joined Orozco, he had a fantastic contract, he thought, in a church of, that I show you, the facade here is the church of an hospital, which is called Jesus de Nazareno, in the middle of Mexico. Mind you, it's in bad shape, and I don't think it's easy to visit, but you can see outside. And inside, Orozco had a project, a fantastic thing to make all the ceilings and all that with painting. But unfortunately, he could not finish it, lack of money anyway, and so it's unfinished. But Orozco at least had the occasion to, Cosgrove at least had the occasion to work with him. When he came back in Canada, the journalist asked him, what was the importance for you of Orozco? And he will tell you, that's what he will answer. He says, one thing I got from him was humility. I never felt that he was the great man exploiting his personality and throwing his weight around. I was impressed above all by his sincerity, integrity, and simplicity, by the creative force of a man who invented a style which was not to me a plastic aesthetic pleasure, although it had nothing of the aesthetic theories that surround us. I was hypnotized by the man. There was something big to reach up to in his spirit, something beyond mere superficial influence. I wish we could have another Orozco exhibition in Canada. We will know that great art comes to a nation when the artist feels that he is serving. That's very important, because for Cosgrove, what he learned from Orozco, it is that you have to serve the nation. And one of the consequences of that for him, it was you have to be readable also. You cannot be just art for art's sake and just to be a kind of little elite addressing yourself to a very little amount of people. He says, in the contrary, we have to have a painting that appeal to the public, in which they will recognize themselves, and not to justify this kind of very elitist type of art that we have today. The fact that he insists on that could be related to a little fact that happened exactly at the same time. This interview that he had with Robert Hare, and then after with Monsieur Bourassa and others, this interview was done around 1950. These interviews that were given by Cosgrove about Orozco coincide in time, in 1950, with an event in which he will be implied, and you will see that have some bearing to what I just said. It is the famous spring show. In Montreal, every year, there was an exhibition organized by the Museum of Fine Arts at the period of spring, and that's why they call it that way. I show you the cover of the catalog of that year in 1950, about the springtime, let's say March and April. And it was an exhibition where anybody could send a picture, and there was a jury, and as a matter of fact, there was two juries, one for more academic type of painting and for more modern one. So the jury that year for the modern painting was, let's say, composed of Stanley Cosgrove, Jacques de Tonnancourt, and Goodrich Roberts. They are, the three of them, excellent painter, but also the three of them were figurative painter. So they received the application of the so-called moderns, and they decided to accept Bordeaux, for instance. There was no problem, but they decided to discard the disciple of Bordeaux, like, for instance, Mousseau. Jean-Paul Mousseau could not have his work recognized, nor Marcel Ferron, and nor Marcel Barbeau. When they heard of that, of this decision of the jury, to exclude them, they decided to make a kind of march in the middle of the museum when it was the opening of the spring show. But this was not so easy to do. You need a card of invitation to get in and everything. More than that, they wanted to be dressed with a kind of, in French, which is homme sandwich. Huh? You know what it means? You have a panel in front of you and another in the back, and you have a hole just there to put your head. And on the panel was written a terrible insult for the jury. Very, very bad taste, horrible. And making play of words on their name and very being scatological. I cannot describe it more than that. So they decided to go to the opening, but as I told you, it was not so easy. So suddenly, one of them find a solution. It is Roussil, the famous sculptor, that was teaching at the time at the school of the museum. The museum had a little school of art, and Lismer hired him, and he was teaching there. So he had his entry more or less in a museum, like an employee. And he found on the table of one of the secretary the famous card of invitation for the spring show. So he took the whole bunch of it, come back to his friends, and they all met in La Hutte Suisse, was a kind of very, very cheap type of little restaurant on Sherbrooke Street at the time. And so they all shared these cards, and also the kind of panel they wanted to bear, and come quietly by small group to the museum. They gathered all together in one room, and when the discourse were of the president and of somebody from the city announcing that the city of Montreal was happy to give $10,000 to the museum, my God, today you will not know what to do with this, but anyway, it was a kind of very fancy type of opening with people all well dressed and things, and suddenly 17 of these guys came dressed with these panels without saying a word, walking in one line. Musso told me that at a certain point, the guards came running to them, wanting to know what it was, trying to read what was written on the panel, but he said since they were English speaking, they could not understand what was written there, and he says we had the time to get in enough in the crowd that he could not do anything to us anymore. And so they go like this for maybe 2-3 minutes, I don't know how much time it took take, and remove their panel, put them on the people if they wanted, or they give them around and disappear. And then after that, they decided to make an exhibition of les refusés, if you want, and they call it l'exposition des rebelles, with a big, big poster outside, and inside a kind of little leaflet that they could give to the visitor that you see here. And so you see, again, Cosgrove was mixed in a kind of debate with the modernist. I think that's why when he was insisting on the fact that Orozco says that art should be understandable to the public, should be close to it, and should not be a tour d'ivoire, a kind of ivory tower in which you enclose yourself and don't take interest in the interest of the publics. And you see that could coincide, of course, with these things of this presence on the jury, and that created this exhibition of the rebelle. The problem that we have now is how this translates in Cosgrove painting. How this is shown. Because if you look at this painting, it's not evident. First of all, you have few still lifes, very perfectly done with kind of, I would say, almost Cézannesque type of presentation. You have the table is folded over, more in the plane of the painting, very well-defined form, and very mute color also. See? Spontaneously, we will rather think of the influence of Cézanne and not of Orozco with a still life. With time, the still life of Cosgrove got closer and closer to a painter that he admired a lot, Giorgio Morandi, Morandi was an Italian painter who was mixed a little bit for a certain time with Chirico, but then become very personal, let's say, and very out of all the trends of modern art, and habitually making still life with very little things, very minimal. And Cosgrove evidently was admire Morandi, and also have created sometimes still life, especially toward the end of his life, who are closer to Morandi. Yeah? So that's the first genre, let's say, that Cosgrove have developed. The second one, you have many representation of, I would say, a woman, not too young, but kind of very calm. Also faces that will express kindness, a kind of very nice attitude, let's say, to the onlooker. Then again, this have nothing to do with the Cortes and with all the machine that you saw in horoscope painting at first sight. And in fact, in style, this maybe could be compared to horoscope, but much more to Matisse, in fact. And finally, the third genre that Cosgrove developed is landscape. And he have an attraction to almost landscape who are very minimal, let's say. You have no habitant, nobody, not even a house, nothing. And it's also very difficult to localize. He called some of them, like this one have been done in La Tuque, but he have other done in Anticosti and other done in Hudson, near where he was living, that look very much like this one. So the localization doesn't seem very, very strong. He have also a series of trees that he is famous for. He made, I would have seen thousands of them. I don't know how many they are, but there's a lot. That are very often inspired from trees near his house in Hudson, near Montreal. And one is called Les Sentinelles because these trees are like sentinel, if you want. And some variation, let's say one is very yellow, the other is blue, gray-blue. So morning fog will go better with the gray-blue. They are repetitive like this, but in a way, there's a reason for that. Because what is exactly the meaning of this these three genres, let's say, in Cosgrove, and how they relate to each other and relate to the thought of both Orozco and Maillard, if you want. I think there is a connection. First of all, these forests that he's showing us all the time, this landscape, let's say, with trees, and this repetition of this theme is pointing to one aspect of the history of Canadian that is important. It is the relation with the forest. After all, we all started like this, with our ancestors were cut with an immense forest. And you could see that the small grove that is left behind that Stanley Cosgrove is representing each time, it is like to put us in contact with this first reality, with this history. The fact that it repeats itself also is interesting. He tried to go toward, which is almost an essence. An essence not in the sense of ideas, but in the sense of something sensible, something that you could feel. And this essence means that you will abstract, that you will remove some details and all that. That's why also, like I mentioned before, some of his picture are difficult to localize. As if, again, he wanted to be at a certain level of generalization that anybody will be able to identify with it. This is certainly come from Orozco, this idea of having a more general point of view. What about the still life? Well, this is one that he did certainly in Mexico, Three Mangoes, and who could be closer to Orozco if you want in style, but not in subject matter. But what is more typical of the still life of Cosgrove is this one, Les cinq pommes vertes, the five green apples. They are presented in very terse way on a kind of tablecloth, and in a little vase like this, or a little plate, let's say, minimal also, and without no indication, let's say, more of localization. I think we are just in front of 5 fruits in a plate. The still life is a difficult genre in a way. It's a genre that it's easy to overlook. To take the expression of Norman Bryson, who wrote a beautiful book about still life. And he says, still life is a world that deal with what we do every day in a way. We eat, we clean dishes, we put them on a tablecloth. This is linked to very simple gesture of everyday life. And he says it is a culture who could decide that this is noble or not. And in a culture in which, for instance, the grand genre of the painting will be the history, will be historical painting, this type of still life could be seen as low genre, as something who is, if not ignoble, at least low and not very important. And when you begin to make this type of difference, you could say that the proliferation of still life is threatening, because what you want to express, of course, it has history. This is important, historical painting, but this thing, it's like not very important. But on the other hand, if it continues, it's there, it's a little bit threatening. What exactly is threatening in still life? It is, first of all, I would say the things that are shown are almost indestructible. They have not changed since centuries. They were invented, I don't know, in Neolithic age, basic shape, and you see them repeated because they are so useful, repeated from one culture to the other, modified a little bit here and there, by some touch of color, some difference of shape, but they are basically very, very strong to go through all the centuries and to be suddenly to us. And it's also, the still life is also referring to the feminine world. And in any patriarchal type of society, you will have, of course, a feeling of threat by anything which is too feminine. And then again, if you think of it, the still life of Cosgrove are affirming, in a way, a certain approach to the simplicity, to what he called humility of Orozco and all this, the simplicity of shapes and of needs that we have when you go to the basic of a society. With time, even, he will very often, in the title of the still life, insist that the little plate that he showed out is from Portneuf. And Portneuf, of course, is a kind of tradition in the earthenware that was produced in Quebec. You have also here le pot d'apothicaire. Again, why to stress that? Because again, that shows the history of these objects, that they come from a long tradition without too much change, and they are very stable, let's say, like any, I would say, national identity should be. And finally, I don't know if you will go as far as I'm going there, the feminine figure in Cosgrove are always quite powerful, very, not expressing anything like anxiety or I don't know what, but very powerful, but also very good, very attentive, let's say. And in fact, it's a kind of mother figure. Look at this one, which is called La Robe Brune. Look at his eye, as the way she bare herself, her big shoulders and all that. You felt a mixture of strength and of goodness, a mixture, let's say, of attention to the other and also of serenity. And this, I could say, well, it happens in other culture, could be a kind of a representation of the mother of the nation, if you want, and a kind of an expression also of the same nationalism. Maybe this is a little bit far-fetched, but you see that even with very different style, very different type of preoccupation, you do have an undercurrent in Cosgrove of the same thing that we had in the Suzor-Côté habitant and all that. This needs to get rooted to the land and to get to the basic and to get to things that are close to us. The second painter that I wanted to deal with today, I don't know if we will have time to present him as it should be, but anyway, I think it's important to make the difference between both, is Louis Muhlstock. Each one knew each other. They were 7-year difference, and they died, unfortunately, very recently, one in 2001 and the other in 2002. It's got very, very close to us. The things was incredible with Muhlstock, it is that he met one of the men that was depicted before by Suzor-Côté. And this make a kind of link with the previous lecture, which is very unexpected. Suzor-Côté had made a portrait of this man, and he gave him here the title, Le Cheminot. That means the guy who works on railways and things like that. And he doesn't give his name there, but you will see we know who he is. And he did then another version of the same guy, but then he called it Paysan du Québec and tried to give him a more, I would say, more important bearing. And finally, there is a third version of the same man, which is very surprising, since now he's transformed in a bishop. But he's the same emaciated guy. As a bishop, he looks down nicely to the people, but nevertheless, with all his bearing, with all his costume, you see that he's a man of the church. He's on the top there. The fantastic thing, it is that the same guy who was the model of Suzor-Côté ended up in Montreal on the corner of Bleury Street and Sainte Catherine and was met by Louis Muhlstock. And he was obviously looking for work, an old man, a little bit destitute. And when Muhlstock asked him, "Can you pose for me?" he says, "Yes, of course, I did it already. I know how to do. I was the model of Suzor-Côté." And then Muhlstock remembered that he had seen indeed the sculpture of the bishop, because it's the Museum of Fine Arts, and he says, "I recognized suddenly that it was the same man." But the depiction of, then finally also he heard his name. It's called Joe Lavallée. So the picture that he made of him after is very interesting because it's very different from what we saw with Suzor-Côté. It's called Joe Lavallée with a bowl of soup because, of course, he was kind of destitute. He lived, you see by the date, 31, 32, who are just after the crash. So he probably left the country because he could not make a living and hoped to make a living in the city, but being a very old man, could not find any job. And he ended up in this refuge, let's say, for the people without work, the unemployed, that was multiplying at the time because of the crisis. And there, Muhlstock went, sit in front of him and made some drawing. And from these drawings, he made this image of resignation, I would say, of a poor man at the end of his rope and being completely dependent of the social system that was in place at the time of the economic crisis. You have another drawing of Muhlstock in which you see him again. He's in the back on the right there with his bowl of soup, but among many people, and that's why I think Muhlstock called this drawing Last Supper at Refuge for Unemployed, or the Last Supper, the last meal ticket, because they were giving a ticket to have a meal, and they went like this to these refuge. There were, as I tell you, there were many of them at the time. Each religion, I would say, will have his own. The family welfare with the Jews, there was a Saint Paul with the Catholic, and you have the diet dispensary with the Protestant. And anyway, you have all these organizations in which Muhlstock could enter and ask if he could sit in a corner and just draw, and they let him do. He made a sweet version of the same thing, and he called it Supper for Two, and asked him, who is this lady? Or he says, I just invented her. I wanted him to have a companion. So it's a kind of sweet way to treat the subject. Who was this Muhlstock? I have a kind of self-portrait when he was a younger man, like he says. He lived very old, very delightful person, very interesting, but there you see he could have some power also. He was born, in fact, in Europe, in what is now Poland, but at the time was still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was born in 1904, and he came in a very, very poor Jewish family. His parents were dealers in little things. That you will see his father will deal with fruits. He will buy fruits in quantity and then sell them one by one to the people. And so he come from a poor Jewish family in Poland, if you want. And then his father came here in Canada first alone. He had some family here. And then 2 years after, he got all his family in Canada. In 1911, the young Muhlstock was living on Rue Saint-Dominique, near Sainte Catherine, and his father was selling fruits. This humble origin, if you want, of Muhlstock creates certainly a certain sympathy with the people around him. We know drawings that he made in the so-called Fletcher Field. And the Fletcher Field was in Montreal. I have a nice description done here by Donald Buchanan that he will tell you exactly what it is. He says it was an open, rather unkempt park where the most ragged and depressed of the unemployed spent their days. Here, Muhlstock did many drawings of men lying asleep on the grass or sitting staring morosely into space. Because of this period of this work, when he went also to those overnight refuge for the out of work to draw naked men grouped under showers or waiting outside in the snow to gain admittance, he came to be known by some as an artist of proletarian significance. But the social content of his early work was not incidental to his human sympathies. Was only incidental to his human sympathies in general, meaning that Buchanan doesn't want to give too much political implication in this type of drawing. In fact, it's true. Muhlstock was certainly a compassionate man, very close to the people that he draw like this, always giving their name when it's possible, and very establishing a real contact with them in that sense, and to my knowledge, not very interested in politics. So then, one of the themes was these unemployed people. The other theme that fascinated him also, it is that people very sick in hospital. He had some friends among doctors at the time, and he became to be fascinated at least by one case, who was known only as Paranka. This was a poor lady, we don't know exactly her age, had an horrible sickness due to lack of certain, I think, hormone or something like that. She was very small. She lost a lot of weight. She was, for her so-called age, she was completely blind, and living like this in a cloth for, I think, 14 years now, without being able to speak, to communicate too much with other people. And she was called only as Paranka. We don't know exactly why, because she could not say herself her name, and we don't know where she come from. And Muhlstock have told in a very touching way how he began to be able to draw the face of Paranka. He says, she was brought to my attention at the time by a friend of ours who was a doctor. It was at the Montreal General Hospital. She was a patient who had been there for 14 years in a crib. She was 21 years old, who weighed about 45 pounds. It was a pituitary disease that reduced her to a skeleton. Paranka had no vision at all. Her eyes were wide open, and the nurse asked her to sit up. She was going to have her picture taken. And so she sat for 5 to 10 minutes, and then took the sheets and just covered her head completely and curled up like a little animal, shelter. That was the end of it. I could not draw anymore. And I came back the next day, and I tiptoed in quietly. And when I began to draw, she heard the sounds of the charcoal on the paper, and so she recognized the sound, and she did the same thing again, just covered herself, and there was no more. I went back, I sat patiently again, moved further back from the cut that she was in, and drew. And for 5 or 6 sessions, I was able to come back and observe her, and I got to know her face. It's an incredible, a very touching way to put it. Habitually, we compare Muhlstock to Kate Kollwitz, which is a great artist, and for whom he had a lot of admiration. But in Kollwitz, habitually, you have a very strong expression of rage of these people, like this Weberzug, the March of the Weavers. You see that they are angry, that they want to have, make almost a revolution. Everyone is armed, and everyone have a face, a very hard face like this. You don't find that in Muhlstock. Huh? We speak before of a kind of compassion, but I think there is something more there. I want to refer to a notion who have been developed by an Italian modern philosopher who's called Giorgio Agamben. And Agamben have worked on, let's say, the structure of power and how, when you have certain sovereignty, you have a tendency also to create zone of, I would say, what he called naked life, meaning that you exclude some people from the form of life that you have defined for most of the others. And you have these rejected people. It says any structure of power will create also like this, what he calls state of exception, people that will not be inside of the ethos of the way to define the society. And I think what attracted, in fact, Muhlstock was exactly that. What he saw in Jola Valley, what he saw in Paranka, what these people were reduced, let's say, just to life, without any other hope, any other way of what we could say a form of life. Agamben referred to the philosopher of the past. He says in Greek, for instance, you have 2 words for life. You have zoe, you have this word in zoology, for instance, and you have bios. And bios, like biology, if you want, have a different meaning. Zoe means life, just to be alive. But bios habitually is associated with something, with a form of life. You could be, for instance, Aristotle will distinguish between the form of life of a philosopher. He will say kind of say a wise form of life from the other, from a worker, for instance. And he will make opposition like that, but always life is not alone. It is in a context. And you could say also that nationalism, language, history, religion, all this also create a context in which you have not only naked life, but also a kind of a culture around it, and you have a form of life, if you want, to take the term of Agamben. And I think that's what Muhlstock, who was not a very political man, but felt that in a structure, even in the modern world, you could say that we have this type of division. And it's paradoxical because the place where this will be created in the most horrible fashion was the concentration camp, in which all these excluded, all the Jews that were there, all the the gypsies and all that were there, were really reduced to naked life. And to a point that they could be executed, they could be just ripped off from the surface of the earth. And you have, I think it's Primo Levi who explained that, you had then in the camps an expression to describe these people who arrive at a level of complete destruction, where they have no hope, and they are, like he says, almost like mechanical, as if he says the sparkle of divinity was extinguished in them. And he used to call them the Muselman. A little bit, we don't know. It can be a play of word on Muslim, if you want, with this idea, you know, that they are very fatalist and all that. And so these people were at the end of their life, and they were ready to be killed without any feeling, or it could be something else anyway. But if you think of Paranka, because when you look at her face, she looks like somebody who had been in concentration camp, which is not true since it's painted here in 1932. But the fact that at a certain point in her relationship with Muhlstock, she was able to cover her face with her sheet, that means that she had kept this kind of dignity and have not went over the border like these poor people in the camps who are completely without hope, and which become, like Primo Levi says, they have been over the border of humanity toward non-humanity. And in the contrary, this gesture of covering her face showed that she had this humanity, she had this human dignity, if you want. And here we are very far from the idea of Maillard, of Orozco, if you want, or even of Cosgrove. We are dealing now with a completely different world. And there is a series of pictures done by Muhlstock also, in which you have another expression of it. He was fascinated by some houses that were completely abandoned. There were nobody living there. The doors were open, and so you could enter, you could see the entrance. He went even to the basement, find this dummy for tailors, let's say, and painted it. And even here he climbs the stairs and end up in a little two-piece apartment. And this again, if you want, in terms of houses, in terms of place, you could say it's very close also to what he did with his personage. And so you saw a completely different approach here. And like I told you, the irony of it, of course, it is that it all starts with the same model than César Côté was using with his Joe Lavallée for Muhlstock. And that history have created a kind of an incredible encounter like this and could make this kind of interweaving of the two ways. But like I told you at the beginning, in this lecture, I wanted to show you the following of the ideology of that we have in César Côté, La Liberté, and Mascotte, and all this. Some following, but some also way to diverge from it. So my two examples, I think, show that relatively clearly. The next lecture will be about our third figure. I announced, you remember, we will do the first figure of the religious, were sisters, and then we had the habitant, and the third figure is the figure of the other, and it's the figure of native people done by our artists. You will see we will deal again with Plamondon, but in a completely different context that we have seen before.